On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Cory Thomas. He is the VP of Engineering at Secureframe. We're going to be talking about how to help teams become more autonomous. And what I mean by that is, how do we help them make better decisions? And how do we, have the right North Star metrics for them to be working towards? We're going to be touching on some areas of understanding why do engineers work on what they have to work on, and how does that actually tie into that being autonomous, and what guardrails we need in place to help them get there. And Cory's got a fantastic background. I appreciate you being on the podcast to talk about this stuff.
Thanks, Amir. Wonderful to be here. This is great.
Absolutely. So let's start off with two things before we dive in. One is let everyone know what Secureframe does. And then just, secondly, as the VP of Engineering, just what are some of your responsibilities?
So Secureframe really helps companies automate all of their security compliance, specifically around frameworks like SOC 2, HIPAA, PCI, GDPR, all of the big frameworks. So we really try and take a lot of the pain out of that. Typically, those type of efforts to get certified in something like a SOC 2 takes many months, up to a year for some companies. We really streamline that through automation, make things very simple.
Awesome. And what are some of your responsibilities as the VP of Engineering there?
Yeah, so I really run all of our engineering teams. So all of the platform teams, ops teams, our feature development teams, really ensuring that things are staying on track and we're delivering what we should deliver to our customers.
All right, well, let's dive in. Interesting topic. Obviously, getting the most out of your team is super important for every engineering leader. And, one thing that everyone's hoping to get to is, teams that are more autonomous, self-governing, all the things Agile wants. So I guess let's kind of start at the top before we dive into some of the details of the episode. And let's just get a sense of how your teams are set up at Secureframe, just to give the context to everything, and then we'll go in from there.
Yeah, for sure. That is pretty critical because it's very important that when you're talking about autonomous teams, it's important that you do have teams set up in such a way that they can become autonomous and work on their own. So that really starts off for us with having teams that are very cross-functional. So making sure that we have as much as we need on the team, depending on the type of team it is. It differs. If it's a feature development team, we may have designers embedded on the team. We may have QA on the team. If it's a platform team that's maybe a more back-end services team, they may not have that. But just making sure whatever the team is that you are creating, that you do have the right mix of folks on that team so that they really have to go, I would say, outside of their team for anything. They can really do a lot of things inside of the team and make all decisions there to move forward. So a lot of our teams are just set up that way. They're specifically designed to make sure that they have as much as we can possibly give them a need on the team to make the right decisions and move forward.
And I guess when we're talking about decision-making, I mean, that's big, right? So maybe at a high level, can we talk about what it is that people are trying to make decisions for, right? I think then we can kind of dive in and understand, some of the metrics that drive that vehicle. But like when you're thinking about decision making, is it to everything? Do you want some of it to be top down? Do you want a lot of it to be bottom up? I mean, what's the, thinking within the org?
Yeah, so I think it differs per org, but generally, when you talk about decision making, you are talking about, as you said, everything. Because this is one of the biggest things is that, especially at all levels, all size companies, but especially at SaaS startups today, like it's critical that you are just making the correct decisions. You can't afford to constantly make the wrong decisions and have to back out of things. So everything has to be very intentional around the decision making. So for me, a lot of it is, some of it's top down, but a lot of it is bottom up. And by top down, I mean, this would be more global decisions. I would say things that affect, the entire org. Maybe you have an e-staff that's making those decisions, or an extended executive leadership team at your company that's making some bigger decisions that are org-wide. But when you're talking about, I think a lot of the listeners are probably thinking of is more feature development, building a product, strong ownership around a certain product per team or over a few teams. You're really talking more about bottoms up. When you're talking about efficiency and shipping things, like can that team make their own decisions based on the inputs that they have to say, okay, this is the direction we should head with this product, or this is the right way to build a feature to support us longer term. Or we're looking ahead and we feel that, this is something that other teams are working on, and this is how we can support them better if we pave the road ahead and do certain things in the product. So a lot of that sort of day-to-day decision making really has to be, I think, bottoms up right on the team.
Absolutely. I think you touched on a few, critical areas. I think most teams, I think big companies, small companies, startup, I don't think it matters. I think these are, once you break down a team of, 5, 10, 50, I think you run into very similar, interesting challenges. I guess when you're looking at, communicating the top down, some of those global decisions, and you're hoping then the teams, then supporting that with the right bottoms up decision making. When that top level is being communicated down, obviously to your managers and then to the team, how much of that is clearly spelled out? I mean, obviously it's clearly spelled, but how deeply or carefully spelled out, or how carefully is that explained to make sure that there's an understanding, but you're not taking away that decision making that you want to empower that team to make?
Right, absolutely. So yeah, totally. So I think you often hear people talk about that in the form of saying an executive team has the vision, or we are creating some sort of goals for the team. So those words like vision, goals tend to be very succinct. A goal can be extremely succinct, and this is exactly what we want to do, but it's not defining the how do you do it, right? And it leaves some room to interpretation, a lot of room to interpretation to get to the end, to get to that goal. So I think that is really where sort of that higher level decision making comes in. Here is a very clear vision of where we want to be. Here is the end result. And then teams, when they're thinking through that and making decisions on how do they get there, they're working back from that. We have a goal, we have a vision in mind. This is what we've been told. This is where we want to go. This is where we have to get to. How do we actually get there? And that's where all of that day-to-day, week-to-week, sprint over sprint decision making comes in, and planning in terms of how do we actually get to that goal. So you're absolutely correct. It's not a top-down thing where this is exactly how you're going to do something. It's really, this is the end product that we want. And then it's up to the teams to figure out how do we make that end product? How do we get there?
Absolutely. I guess, every org will be run differently. And ideally, you'll leave the how to the doers. And as you're kind of, communicating that North Star, and it's going down from the C-level suite to the VP layers and down to the managers and down, as you're looking at that process and you're watching it, when you're actually talking to your managers and you're trying to come up with those metrics, like where's that collaboration? Obviously, every manager has a distinct team. Every manager knows their team. How much of that bottom up support that the individual contributors need is sitting there with the managers and making sure that you're supporting them with what they really have to deal with on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways to do this. And I think a lot of it does sit with managers. For us specifically at Secureframe, we have managers and we also have this concept of a technical lead. That isn't really a title, but it's a role. And sometimes they'll step in and, work with managers initially to come up with some high-level ideas. We often call, sometimes level zero, right? Ideas of saying, here's a base idea, here's how we think we can do this before bringing the team in. So it does help to maybe go away first with a smaller group, which could be technical leads, maybe your more senior engineers, maybe SMEs, subject matter experts. There's a bunch of ways this could come together, but a smaller group to first sort of pave the road a little bit and say, okay, let's at least get some gravel down. And this is where we think we can go before bringing in the rest of the team to flesh out those ideas even more and to create the real pavement, right? So I think that's really how we do it. I've seen that work very well, but it isn't usually left up to one person like a manager. There would be a few people involved. And on a cross-functional team, that might mean that you have an engineering manager, a technical lead, and a product manager and a design lead or something, all working on this together before the rest of the team sort of gets involved.
Absolutely. I guess when you're sitting there and looking at the metrics that the team's hoping to establish as they're managing this matrix team, who ultimately is responsible for those metrics, I guess, within what you guys are doing?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it, again, this sort of varies. So we have different levels of metrics, and I've worked in different situations with different levels. I've worked a lot with OKRs, where there'll be very high level company-wide OKRs, and those ladder down to sort of department or zone level or whatever OKRs before you get into team OKRs. That's a good way to go, where everything sort of supports everything up and down the ladder, which is great. That's one way. Another way, though, is to have something very simple again with goals. And we tend to do this at Secureframe. I mean, I think this is a bit of a simpler approach, but works extremely well, where it's like, hey, at an exec team level, we have these goals that we want to achieve by the end of the year or the end of the quarter. And then those sort of ladder down to the teams for them to make their own goals at that level and say, okay, here are some goals that we have that will support those goals going up. Very similar to OKRs, but a little bit simpler to reason about, especially in a fast-moving startup where you may not have time to track all of the OKR stuff, and it can sometimes get a little bit too complex across all the teams.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, you guys are fast moving. Complexity and process doesn't necessarily lend itself. When you guys are looking at those goals, and obviously you're looking at the team's goals, how frequently do those goals get reevaluated? Is it, I guess, what increment of time does that examine? Just because you are fast moving.
Yeah, we usually do quarterly goals, and we break a quarter into 2 6-week chunks. Like I would say, phase 1 of the quarter, phase 2, section 1, section 2. So I find that to be the easiest. And I've experimented with doing this a variety of ways. Monthly, we've tried that, but 4 weeks just doesn't seem enough time to really execute on something well, depending on the size of the goal. Some of the smaller ones maybe, but not some of the larger ones. So we tend to break our quarters in half, but we will set goals for a quarter and then say, okay, we're going to break that down into like half the quarter, first half and second half. That works well. This really, I think, depends on a lot of things for companies. It depends on the type of product that you're shipping. It depends on customer expectations and how quickly you think you have to move for the customer. It can depend upon your competition and how much competition is there and how fast you have to move to beat them. There's a lot of things, that can weigh into that. But I think starting with something simple and sort of testing the waters, like let's try monthly. Does monthly work? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I do prefer shorter time frames, I think, with a startup because things can change very rapidly. So unless you're a very established company that can say, here's a 3-year roadmap and, we basically are going to do this for the next 3 years. Yeah, there'll be some changes, of course, there always is, but it won't change that dramatically. Versus a newer startup that's like, oh, we have to shift really quickly, to maybe block a competitor or to get out in front of something or something like that. It can be very different. But I think a lot of this really comes down to a little bit of common sense and just trying things and saying, hey, does a quarter work? That seems to work. It's not too long. Maybe we break that quarter in half and that works. You really have to try things and see what works.
Sure. You mentioned when things aren't working. Obviously, you run 2 6-week iterations within the quarter. When you're looking at identifying those things that don't work, what are some of those signals that I guess you're hoping to see early to go, hey, this isn't working, we need to stop? Are there any particular metrics or signals that you guys keep an eye on just to be able to observe that?
Well, really a lot of it is, for me, there's a bunch of metrics that you can track. We do use standards like DORA metrics, but 2 of the bigger ones that I track really closely are just time to delivery, like how long is it taking us to actually get something out, right? If we're finding that we're falling behind, of course, that's a problem. And also quality, like how many, sort of issues are we shipping, right? If we're shipping with a lot of problems or bugs, and that's another signal that says, maybe we have to slow down or start doing something differently. So that's what I really try to watch is if we have a date in mind and we say, okay, we want this done within 6 weeks, week over week, how are we actually tracking towards that? Are we finding that if we're keeping up this pace that we're introducing a lot of bugs? How are engineers feeling? Does this feel like everything is just so tight that we can't keep up? Sometimes this is even more of a feeling that you have that you see throughout the org where it feels a little bit like a runaway train sometimes, right? Where it's just like, oh, wow, things are getting away from us. And that's not a good thing. You want to be on the edge because you want speed, you want to be quick, but it can't be a runaway train where things just get out of control. So sometimes a lot of this is also just the feeling to say, hey, we don't feel comfortable with this. And we're starting to see things slipping or we're seeing mistakes being made that shouldn't be made because we're just moving way too fast. And then we can go back and adjust. right? Our timelines.
So I guess you have to kind of maybe go back to, autonomous teams. And you mentioned something interesting because obviously you want to move quickly. You want to deliver high quality code, right? High quality product. You don't want any issues. You want everyone to be happy. It always doesn't happen. Obviously people are making trade-offs and obviously, we don't want to talk about technical debt because that's a whole different topic or episode. But when people are, making autonomous decisions at the team level, how are you communicating? Obviously you mentioned two key metrics, and then that kind of maybe works a little bit out of sync with, delivering not too quick, but just quick enough and keeping high quality. How does the team then balance that to make sure they're making the right decisions?
Absolutely. So this is where you need some mechanisms in place to actually empower the team to make good decisions. So simply saying, okay, I'm going to put together a team. I have some smart people. They're bright. We've hired the best we can get. We feel really good about the people we have. They can go make really good decisions. You have to feed that. So there has to be a lot of inputs and the right tooling, I would say, in place to help them make decisions, right? So this means that this isn't a matter of just moving very quickly, making sure that, again, you have a very clear North Star that you're going for. Sometimes your values play into this. And I'm not talking about values that just sit in Confluence or something that in your wiki that nobody ever reads. Values that really help people make decisions. When they look at these values, it's like, oh, this helps guide my thought process. These are the things that this company truly believes in. And that's how I should start thinking about this problem, right? Another thing is just having the right tooling around. I mean, one of the things that I really love is something called DACI, which is really just a way to codify, write down, and this works very well, especially in a remote environment, your decisions and have the right people involved in making those decisions. So DACI, if you haven't heard of it, stands for Driver, Approver, Contributor, Informed. And essentially, it's something that you write down where you list all of your options. So you may have, let's say you had a cloud migration to do. And you could go to AWS, you can go to Azure, or you can go to GCP, or maybe you could go on-prem. Maybe that's one of the options. You would list all of those options out. You would have, and this is very quick and easy to do. This doesn't have to take a lot of time, depending on what the decision is. You'd have all of your options. You list the pros, the cons, the risks, any research that you've done, maybe cost, and other things in there that are very clear. And you can bring in the right people to look at that decision and say, hey, does this seem to look right? Are we headed in the right direction if we go with option one? And you can weigh those things so that you can make the best decision possible. So again, as long as you have the right sort of mechanisms in place and the right things around decision-making and you're empowering your teams to make good decisions, then you're okay. So it's really not about saying, hey, I've got a bunch of people together and they can go make the best decision. They'll figure it out. That doesn't always work. It can work for some smaller things, but it can't work for everything.
I guess, decision making, being autonomous comes with mistakes, right? I mean, we are all human. We're going to make those mistakes. And when you're wanting to empower people to make decisions, I've always believed you've got to let them make mistakes. Like you can't, say do this and then slap them on the wrist for doing it and getting it wrong. How does the team deal with, when things don't go right? I mean, obviously, I know you guys have, codifying decisions. I like that. I'm starting to see that a lot, especially with remote teams. But when something doesn't go right at the team level, how do you guys go back and kind of do, the retrospective and kind of do the postmortem and figuring out how that could have improved overall?
Right. So I think it's important to point out that like autonomous or non-autonomous teams, people are going to make mistakes. Things will go wrong just because you have autonomous teams. If you've done it correctly, and like I said, try to empower the teams and give them the right tools to make good decisions, it can be far more foolproof than coming top down and leaving all the decisions to a small group of people and saying, oh, well, they'll make all the decisions when they may not have all the information. So autonomous teams don't necessarily mean that there'll be more bad decisions or anything made, but it does happen. And when it happens, yes, it's important to go back. Now, codifying is a big deal. So making sure that stuff is written down so you can review the decision. One of the worst things is when something happens and you're left scratching your head. How did that happen? I don't know. Well, how did we make that decision? Who made that? What was behind it? Did we do research on this? Did we look at that? Did we talk to this person? If that stuff isn't written down, it may seem like, oh, do we have to write this down? But it helps. this is a huge help when things go wrong because you can go back and re-examine that. And that's when you can do a good postmortem, do like a 5 whys exercise to really dig in, to keep asking like, why this, until you get to the answer, right? So that's usually how we handle it, is really doing that postmortem and digging deep into looking back at the decision that we've written down and how we got there. And then, what should we have done differently, right? So it's not handled much different than any other decision. But normally, with a lot of these autonomous teams, what I found is you have much more information to work off when things actually do go wrong.
Makes sense. I think what you said there about the postmortem, I think what I was hearing is it's not about accountability. It's about actually helping the whole team improve.
It's learning.
Yeah, it's learning. I try to tell my 9-year-old it's not failing. You're just learning, and you're going to have to do it differently so that you end up with a different result. And I think a lot of times we, have put too much stress on that failure. And I think obviously things are changing, but I like that. It's not about the accountability necessarily. I guess to couple with that, you want to obviously help the team. Guide rails are important, right? So you got to have some of those, barriers to help people and give them a better opportunity and a chance to succeed. What kind of guide rails do you guys put in place when it goes to this, autonomous decision making and making sure the team's, trying to drive that bottom up?
Yeah, so a lot of this, I think, and the guide rails are very important, and it's also something that has gotten more complex, I think, in SaaS. So, I started my career a long time ago when every engineer was a full stack engineer. You did everything. It didn't matter where you worked or what. You did front end, back end, you were doing some design, you did it all, right?
Yeah.
And now it's so different with platform teams and operations teams and everything else. So I think teams can be one guide rail and say, okay, there's definitely a delineation here between what our team does and a feature development team versus a platform team. So ownership is a big thing. Making sure that there's very strong ownership and it's well known who owns what areas can be a guide rail right there. So you don't have people too concerned about things that they shouldn't have to be, that someone else owns, and they have trust in someone else to do that and work together, right? So I think that's one big one for the guide rails. The other things are, what we actually even believe in, right, is a big thing. Again, sort of going back to the values, if you say we believe in shipping incremental value very quickly, that's a lot different than saying we believe in taking, 2 to 3 weeks to make sure that when we've committed to something, we ship the entire thing in one shot. Those are two totally different things. So I think making sure that the teams understand we have a set of values that apply to all of our teams, and this is how we think about problems, and this is our operating cadence, and this is how we work, is also a big deal when it comes to guide rail.
I like that. I think that's great insight. And I like the fact that, that ownership piece, that, hey, I'm going to leave it to you. I trust you. With ownership, comes trust. I think going back to, what you mentioned with accountability in the postmortem, I think that is very integral to making sure people are more responsible for their part of the sandbox and not necessarily worrying and looking at the other person and what they're doing.
Yeah, for sure. And it all feeds into, I often tell people, like, as an engineering leader, what is one of the biggest things? Sometimes people say, what are the things that an engineering leader really brings? Like, what's one of the biggest things you can do? There's a few, hiring, et cetera, but efficiency is a big one. And this plays into efficiency as well, making sure that the teams are as efficient as possible. And a lot of that is having them sometimes do less, right? Like, not worry about this or that or the next thing, just being extremely focused on their specific area and having extreme ownership over that area really helps with efficiency.
Absolutely. It's a great topic. I think probably could talk about this for beyond the half an hour. I'm sure we could make this into multiple episodes in one, and maybe we have to have you come back and talk a little bit more in depth in a particular area down the road. I was going to ask you, we've been asking this question to more leaders and it's been interesting, but if there's a future guest that you'd like for them to cover a topic or answer a specific question, what would you like for them to do?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think what would be interesting is hearing about how I think some engineering leaders are approaching 2022 in this economy. How are they approaching hiring? How are they thinking about, how they should scale up their engineering or scale down? Like, what changes are they making to accommodate the new world we're living in with this economy. That has been a pretty rough start to 2022.
That's fair. Yeah, things are certainly different now than they were about 7-8 months ago. And, talking about scaling down's a whole conversation that a year ago no one thought we'd be having. I mean, some people did, but hey, overall, we didn't worry about too much. That's a good one. Hopefully, I can find somebody who can talk about some of the adjustments they're making. I think you always have to make those adjustments. And if somebody wants to reach out to you, pick your mind on anything you've mentioned or just kind of continue the dialogue with you, what's a good way of getting hold of you?
Yeah, I think probably the best way is on LinkedIn. That's where I'm more active. So my LinkedIn is just, linkedin.com. I think it's /in/Cory Thomas, CoryThomaf.
Okay. We'll make sure to include that. Thanks for coming on. I mean, I think lots of great nuggets in there. I think great content. I appreciate you sharing with everyone.
Awesome. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Amir.
All right. Thanks, Cory. That's it for this episode. We'll be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, I always ask for two things. One, share the episode if it's been useful. That's pretty much how the podcast has been growing. And if you know someone or you yourself have some thoughts on how we're making some adjustments and changes to Cory's question, dealing with the new economics of the times, let me know. I'd love to have you on to chat about that. Until next time, thank you. Goodbye.